If you're feeling bogged down by the impossible expectations or the noise of new year, new me, take a second to pause. Grow Therapy gives you space to slow down, check in, and start the new year from a more grounded place. Whether it's your first time in therapy or your 50th, Grow makes it easier to find a therapist who fits you, not the other way around. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. And if something comes up, you can cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Grow accepts over 100 insurance plans, including Medicaid in some states. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0, depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
This is episode 149 of That Shakespeare Life. Today's episode is brought to you by Experience Shakespeare. Experience Shakespeare is the membership arm of That Shakespeare Life that offers you monthly digital history activity kits that let you try at home the history you learn about on the show. They work like science labs for history. Stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Lodder, tattoo historian from the University of Essex in the UK. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
One of the biggest things that people come away with is, what were they seeing? And it's when you read enough instances of smart people saying that they're seeing these mermaids and mermen and describing them in concrete terms, it really causes you to start to reflect, what are they seeing? Should I believe them? Should I not?
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When medieval cartographers drew maps of the world, they included mermaids among the fantastic ocean beasts that they believed roamed the waters of foreign lands. Professional explorers like Henry Hudson in 1608 described sighting a mermaid in the North Atlantic Ocean, describing how the mermaid called to the men on his ship. Philosophers, physicians, and clergymen all described in detail the discovery, examination, and even display of mermaid bodies. There was a pervasive belief that mermaids were real and a definite threat to anyone traveling the ocean. One of the most popular settings for Shakespeare's plays, Italy, was known to be a gathering place for these mermaids. Along with the individuals who saw mermaids in the wild, there were also persistent and incredible stories of mermaids like Melusine, who married a king of Scotland. Despite the centuries of folklore, mermaids seem to have a consistent description as to who and what they were and where you would be able to find one. The 15th century saw a specific rise in the stories of mermaids, and by the time Shakespeare was writing about them, mermaids were a well-established part of Renaissance thought across the British Isles. Here this week to take us back to the 16th century British Isles and share with us the history, folklore, and science behind mermaids to examine exactly what Shakespeare would have understood or believed about mermaids is the man who wrote the book on Merpeople, Vaughn Scribner. Vaughn Scribner is an associate professor of history at the University of Central Arkansas. He is the author of Merpeople, A Human History, which explores the history of mermaids and mermen across the world, including the many surviving reports from sailors, pirates, and explorers who claim to have seen these fantastic creatures. Vaughn has also published in Civility, Urban Taverns in Early American Civil Society, in addition to various articles and book chapters which cover the environmental, social, and political history of the British Empire. Find links to Vaughn's work in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Vaughn. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing good. Glad to have you back. And we are here to talk about Vaughn's book, Merpeople, in which he points out an extensive medieval history foundation for the 16th century understanding of mermaids. And it seems there was a vague line between fact and fiction when it came to mermaids. Vaughn, would people in Shakespeare's lifetime have believed mermaids to be real creatures?
Yes. This is something I think about a lot. And this is always one of the most enjoyable things as a historian, and also one of the struggles, is trying to get into people's mindsets in the past. You know, there are these ideas that the past is a different world. But I might have mentioned this in my previous podcast. I can't remember. But one of the biggest things I always tell my students from my historical research is people haven't changed. The world we live in has. Now, people in the 16th century, a lot of people did indeed believe in merpeople because it makes sense, because they grew up around them. They were everywhere. So, and I'll get into this, kind of more probably later on in this piece, but the church very much created this idea, our modern idea of a mer person, a mermaid and a merman. And interestingly though, so by the 16th century, these worshipers in churches, especially in the British Isles, but in Italy as well, and throughout Europe for that matter, France as well, they would have worshipped surrounded by merpeople all the time. There were mermaids, especially mermaids, carved into different, wooden structures, benches and things of the church. There were mermaids carved into the ceilings and the roof bosses. There were mermaids in bestiaries. And so my kind of working theory is that they grew up seeing these merpeople in the church, and they heard all these tales about merpeople, about people coming across mermaids. So they were expecting not just to find them at home, but eventually, especially during this Renaissance period, during Shakespeare's time, as they're starting to venture out, they're expecting to find them. So I would say that a lot of people did believe in them. And my kind of, just to wrap this up, is that mermaids were part of this idea of stretching the human imagination, of stretching not just the imagination, but humanity's understanding of the world around them. And there are these theories coming about as early as the 16th and 17th centuries that humans came from the water. Humankind started in the water. So it only made sense that perhaps if humans started in the water, there'd be these hybrid creatures, as we'll probably talk about more as well. There were these other hybrid creatures they were finding. So it wasn't a stretch of the imagination to think that there were these merpeople out there, especially when you're hearing all these tales about them, and you're seeing them represented in the holiest of places and one of the most legitimate places in the 16th century, which would be the Christian church, the center of not just life, but also governance. So yeah, a lot of people did indeed believe in merpeople. And another thing I say often, you have these smart people going out and looking for them and drawing them and things. We're still looking for our own mermaids today. We're not calling them mermaids anymore, but we're pushing the bounds of humans' understanding of the galaxy, of the earth. And so mermaids were part of this larger push in that way too. It went beyond just tradition and folklore by the 16th century. It's starting to kind of transition this Enlightenment, quote, modern idea of exploration, understanding humanity, etc.
We're going to step back just a bit from Shakespeare's lifetime to grab one of these stories. But we want to point out that when it comes to them understanding mermaids as real creatures, this wasn't based merely on an intellectual concept. There were actual mermaid sightings, people who said they had seen these mermaids. And one sighting Vaughn's book cites specifically comes from 1187. He writes, quote, in 1187, fishermen off the coast of England caught a strange creature resembling in shape a wild or savage man, end quote. Vaughn, were there stories from Shakespeare's lifetime of people finding what they considered to be real merpeople?
Definitely. And this, when I started researching for this, well, it started off as articles and then eventually the book. This was one of the things that surprised me most, was just how many verified sightings there were. And this is critical, and this idea of them being verified, because they weren't just someone, some random ship crew member saying, I saw something in the water. These were intellectuals. These were people who were trusted. So for instance, in 1533, this Spaniard named Diego Hurtado claimed to encounter a merman off the coast of Polynesia. And this is key. In the quote, seen by all the crew, near a deserted island, 30 leagues from the continent, merman apparently or supposedly leapt about in the water like a monkey, with his eyes fixed on the crew like a creature imbued with reason. So this idea that they're describing the merman in very clear terms, but they're also using terms like seen by all the crew, okay? And then saying that it seems like something that had reason, like it's this real creature. In 1566, a French priest said that he saw a mermaid in present-day Ethiopia. Apparently, the merman had been washed ashore by a flood and was heard to cry. And then his female companion came up crying aloud, and these are quotes, and sorrowing for the absence of her mate. After witnessing this, what they called wonderful and strange thing, the Frenchman could only remark, the sea doth nourish and bring forth diverse and strange kinds of monsters as well as the land. So here you have them making these connections early on between the sea and the land, humanity and beasts. And so these are pretty modern ideas according to even our present time. We're still trying to understand, we're still finding strange things in the ocean all the time, discovering new creatures and beasts. And so it went beyond just some kind of portentous idea of mermaids oftentimes and traditionally associated with the dangers of the ocean or myths of the sea. By the 16th century, you have them really associating with verified sightings. And it's no coincidence that they're coinciding with Western Europeans' trade routes by the 16th century as well. So they're seeing it in places like, China, the Far East, as they would have called it, Africa, India. So they're not only validating the existence of merpeople, but they're also confirming for Europeans this extraordinary nature of these foreign lands, because they believe that the farther that they got away from civilization, as they called it, of course, they're going to find these strange beasts in these strange lands. And this is eventually going to be very much so reflected in these maps that they're drawing as well.
One of the places we see mermaids depicted in artwork, as you mentioned, is from the church. Vaughn, what was the 16th century church's opinion of mermaids? I mean, you've mentioned that they're including them on their benches and in the rooftops of their churches and things, but why are they so prevalent in the religious artwork of this period?
This is really interesting. And so in my book, oftentimes people want to talk about, these merpeople come about in these Homerian narratives and things, but I kind of argue against that actually. In the ancient, Greek and Roman times, mermaids and mermen as we know them are never depicted in this way. Like harpies, they're never depicted as half women, half fish, or half men, half fish. They were depicted as harpies or Scylla, which was this grotesque creature. The medieval church is the one who creates this idea. Now, initially, the medieval church creates mermaids, especially, as this way to kind of decenter the feminine, to make men, especially these male priests, worried about the dangers of the flesh. But by the 16th century, they've come to this interesting crossroads, because they've created this idea of mermaids and mermen to an extent, but mermen are often pictured as more demure. They're even mermonks. Mermaids are topless, which was a very rare, topless woman in the church was a very rare thing. And they're kind of at this crossroads, like I mentioned, because they've created this idea of the mermaid. Now they're for their own purposes. But by the 16th century, they're also kind of trying to negate this idea of the mermaid for their own purposes as well, because it's kind of gotten out of hand. Now, they're still describing them according to like the medieval Christian tradition, especially in bestiaries. So a guy an Englishman named Andrew Lawrence in 1527 has this bestiary. Now, just for readers, a bestiary are these books that illustrated volumes that churches would oftentimes create that were these narratives of the Bible and the human story, but they'd be lavishly illustrated, and mermaids were almost always in them. And so, but all kinds of strange creatures were in these bestiaries. If you ever want to just, for the listeners, if you ever want to just kind of go on an interesting tangent, start Google searching some, medieval and 15th, 16th century bestiary images. You find all kinds of crazy stuff in there. Yeah, trust me, you're not ready.
I'm going to throw out Conrad Gessner as a great one to Google. Yes.
Things get trippy really fast. And that's one of the things I noticed when I started studying this. I'm like, what is going on? But they described them in this 1527 bestiary. Andrew Lawrence says is the mermaid is a deadly beast that bringeth a man gladly to death. For the navel up, she is like a woman in a dreadful face. And then his accompanying image was a direct copy of previous bestiaries and carvings. In fact, just a quick aside, we've all seen the Starbucks logo. Well, it's really zoomed in now. Originally, the Starbucks logo was from a 16th century bestiary, and it was of a mermaid with her tail spread, which was a very suggestive sexual depiction of the mermaid. You have in the 16th century these these bestiaries depicting mermaids in these classic ways and saying that they're dangerous. But something else that's interesting that's going on with the Christian church by the 16th century is that the Bible now is being mass produced because of the printing press. So before this, people couldn't read generally, and they didn't have access to these Bibles because they were handwritten volumes. The church basically was the only one who had access to these. So the church could really control the narrative very much. But by the 16th century, people were able to start reading the Bible and learning about it more, but they're also relying upon the Bible more. So you have people also coming out and saying mermaids can't exist because they're never mentioned in the Bible. So you have one Spaniard in 1600 saying that he recounts all these various mermaid sightings, apparent mermaid sightings, but he concludes that I have never seen any author worthy of credit that make mention hereof in the Bible or other words. So he's saying that these people aren't credited, and therefore that these are just mere fables. So the church then by the 16th century has both created this idea of the mermaid, but they're also trying to grapple with it now with this idea of like, what have we done? We have all these people thinking that there are these creatures out there. How do we kind of come to terms with this? Just for our listeners, these churches, the mermaids are all still there. I led a study abroad trip, in 2019, the summer of 2019, which feels like a million years ago, in England and Scotland. And we visited all these medieval churches, and I'd always challenge my students to look around and find mermaids. And they found mermaids in every church. They're everywhere. And so they're still very much with us. And the church is the one, though, who really started this. And by the 16th century, you have the kind of this diverging idea of, okay, we've created it, but do we want to embrace this idea of God's like natural splendor and that he can create anything? Or would God actually create this half human, half fish beast? How does this fit in with our kind of ideas where we want to go forward?
Shakespeare's lifetime was rife with oceanic exploration. As Vaughn mentions, one of the places they're finding these mermaids is along the trade routes. And that includes explorers going not only to the New World with people like the Puritans establishing places like Jamestown, but also explorers were often traveling the oceans in search of new and exotic goods like spices or animals. Vaughn, when these explorers like Sir Walter Raleigh or others traveled across the ocean, was there a real fear for them of encountering a mermaid on this travel?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was a fear so much as it was an interest. Don't get me wrong. You have instances of mermaids and mermen allegedly trying to clamber upon ships and the crew members beating them off with oars or trying to kill them. John Jocelyn, for instance, was a guy in the 17th century, an English explorer in the New World. And he claimed that he was resting in a canoe, kind of taking a nap in a canoe in a river just inland from the ocean. And a merman tried to climb into his boat and he cut its arm off. And it bled purple blood and sunk into the depths. This was actually the first account of a merman I ever found. Just to
start things off with a bang, yeah.
Yeah, right. So this is where it all started, actually. So in my research, I don't usually, this mermaid thing came out of nowhere in many ways. I read a lot of travel diaries and newspaper articles from my 18th century primary source research, and I'm reading John Jocelyn's account, and this comes out of nowhere. I'm like, what is he talking? A merman tried to climb into his canoe and he cut its arm off and it like bled and sunk into the depths. So I made a note of that and kind of put it aside. I'm like, I'm going to come back to this.
Yeah, we got to revisit this.
Yeah, exactly. The very next day, I'm reading the Pennsylvania Gazette, which is published by Benjamin Franklin in the 18th century. And he describes a merman in Italy, off the coast of Rome. And I'm like, what is going on here? So that's where I really dove in, you'll say, to all of this. But there was fear. Don't get me wrong, where people are seeing these mermaids and they're like, oh my gosh, what do we do? There's a really grotesque instance of these little girls in Brest, France, who find a mermaid on the shore, kind of who's been washed up, and they cut its hands off apparently, and then push it back in the ocean. That one really disturbed my wife.
Yeah. But
generally speaking, when they're going out, these explorers aren't scared to find them. So you see Christopher Columbus and Henry Hudson both saying that they've seen a mermaid in their travels, and they don't depict it as a fearful thing, but rather as part of the wonders of the New World. And you even have a fake, you mentioned Jamestown, until just recently. This is one of the other really fun things I had in doing this mermaid research. Until just recently, all these scholars had been saying that John Smith saw a mermaid in the New World. Between the dates range from 1610 to 1614. Well, when I was doing my research, I thought, well, I need to, because whenever they were citing this, though, they were just citing other historians. So, well, this historian said that John Smith saw a mermaid. Well, a part of being a historian is you have to actually go back to the original primary source. So I thought, well, John Smith's a big name. If he said he saw a mermaid, this is a big deal. So I read literally every scrap of John Smith's writing. Never in any of his writing did he say anything about seeing a mermaid. So I thought, what is going on? So long story short, I dove in the historical record and realized that in I think it was 1620 or maybe 1630. I think more like 1620. An English author misattributed a sighting by another Englishman named Richard Whitbourne to John Smith. I think that it was because John Smith was such a big name at this point that this would sell more copy if you said like, oh, John Smith saw it. Since then, though, historians until 2015 had all been saying that John Smith saw a mermaid because, quite frankly, they hadn't gone back to the primary source and figured this out. So this has been also it was one of these rare instances in my historical career where I'm able to kind of debunk this long myth at this point. And so it's also been a great teaching moment for my students and for other historians in this way, just that we always have to go back to the source.
Always.
And so I wrote a couple blog posts on that you can find on earlyamericanist.com. I think it speaks to this idea of early explorers, not just them wanting to find mermaids, but people wanting them to find mermaids as well to confirm their lingering beliefs in mermaids. It gets back to this kind of chicken and the egg idea. Did they see merpeople and that created people believing in mermaids, or did they go out wanting to find mermaids and that's why they found them? So it's a fair question. And when we're saying that they are reporting sightings from their travels, they were reporting something that they did actually see. Now, whether or not they saw a mermaid like they thought they did is the question. And Vaughn writes that there were some real animals discovered in the ocean travels of these explorers who were often considered to be physical representations of mythical creatures of folklore that the explorers had read about. Vaughn writes, quote, Europeans found all sorts of monstrous creatures in the Americas, just as Marco Polo noted a variety of wondrous flora, fauna, and creatures in his eastern travels. So too did New World explorers like Sir Walter Raleigh and Christopher Columbus claim to interact with everything from headless men to cyclops to the cynocephalus. And Vaughn includes an illustration of this animal for reference, and the drawings definitely look like a mix of human and animal. Vaughn, what were some of the animals these explorers came across that they thought were mythical creatures? Yeah, this is one of my other favorite things about this, and I think it's another good moment to just reflect, is that they were going to what to them was an entirely new world. And we don't have any, we're exploring space more and things like that now, but it's interesting to put yourself in the mindset of a 16th century European. Say you're someone living in London in Shakespeare's time, and you're hearing about these people going to these strange new worlds and coming into contact with not just strange new people like Native Americans with all these different customs, but all this flora and fauna as well. We don't have anything like it today. We think we've only explored like a quarter of the ocean, but still that sense of wonder is largely lost compared to what people were experiencing then. And this is important to note because it really opens people up to really being ready to almost believe anything. I should mention that, it's no coincidence that Shakespeare includes mermaids in 3 different plays. But like you said, they're one of many of these mythical creatures. Now, you mentioned some more of the fantastical ones, headless men, cyclops. My favorite is actually the possum. We think of the possum now. It's kind of weird, but, you see them everywhere, especially in America. Well, you see possum, this idea of playing possum. Possums are really weird. They were the first marsupial that Europeans came across. And when you think about it, they didn't know what to think. Like, what is going on here? You've got this strange little creature who has a pouch and it carries its children in this pouch in its stomach. And Europeans had a really hard time how do we grasp this? They really compared the possum to, they used it as an allegory for human women and for, fecundity and fertility and the hybridity of women. And they really tried to use it to kind of put these kind of negative ideas upon women.
I think about the overlap between like narwhals and rhinos and the unicorn, and the way that, the first time they ever saw, because we mentioned Conrad Gessner, and he's got drawings of the rhino, and they're described as being, here's a unicorn, and it's a picture of a rhinoceros.
Oh, and these in these cabinets of curiosity, which we'll get to in a bit, one of the most common items in these European cabinets of curiosity was a unicorn's horn. And that's what they called it, but it was just a narwhal horn. But they're going out and finding these strange, not just creatures, but also think about all the strange plants that they're finding as well in the New World. And one of the most popular things in 16th, 17th century London, if you're an elite man, you wanted plants from exotic, far-off places that you could grow in your London garden and greenhouse, because it gave you real cultural capital. And they're also sending animals back from the New World as well. They often die en route, unfortunately, but they're trying to send them back as these establish this mastery over the natural world. And that's very much a part of this imperial push. So when they're coming across these strange creatures and animals, whether real like the possum or not real like the Cyclops or headless men, it's not just a part of them saying, look at this strange new world we found, and we're in this whole new realm, but it's also us. We need to categorize these creatures. It's no coincidence that eventually you've got someone like Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern classification. He's huge, and they're like, he hears these tales of mermaids, and he's saying we have to go out and find them, because this is an important part of the human story and categorizing, classifying the world around us. So I think too that this is something I've talked about with my wife, and she made this good point that I hadn't thought about, is that, well, I kind of had, but not like she mentioned it, is that like, if you're someone like Christopher Columbus or Henry Hudson, saying that you're Walter Raleigh, saying that you're seeing these fantastical creatures in the New World is going to give you some cultural capital as well. If you're coming back home and saying, oh, when I saw this, people will be really entranced. You're sitting in an English alehouse and you have these stories, or even, telling the king or queen of England, this is what we found. It's really gives you this power.
It's 16th century street cred. It is.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. It's no different than these same men eventually, or, men like them saying that, oh, I ventured into North America and just in the distance, I saw this city of gold, but we ran out of supplies. You need to fund us to go back. So these cities of gold end up being pueblos, but they're really pushing their bounds, and it really does give them a certain, like you said, street cred and power. And I think we cannot discount that. But people do the same thing today. Like I said, we haven't changed. I mean, people say they've seen things. People say they've done things that they haven't.
Absolutely. People don't change. The world does.
Yes, exactly. The world. People don't change. The world we live in does. Yes, very much.
Conrad Gessner comes up frequently here on That Shakespeare Life. We love him because his writings and illustrations often provide us visual insight into the 16th century perspective on life. And when it comes to mermaids, there's no exception. Vaughn writes about Conrad Gessner as a source of understanding mermaids when he says, quote, in the Swiss philosopher Conrad Gessner contended that a man-fish about the size of a boy was seen at Rome. Vaughn, why is it significant that Gessner placed the mermaid in Rome specifically? I think about your reference earlier to Benjamin Franklin writing about seeing a mermaid in this exact place. Was Italy a common place for mermaids to be found during Shakespeare's lifetime?
Yes. Now, not just, okay, so it's interesting here because this idea of them found, there were definitely sightings, a lot of sightings of merpeople around Italy in general. But you also have to remember that, it was this flourishing of the Renaissance and trade. It was one of these major trade depots, really the first. You have Italy between, the Middle East and the, quote, Far East and Europe. And so you have a lot of money. It's this very seaborne society. One of my favorite books that I'm going to recommend later is this book called The Mermaids of Venice, which is this incredibly illustrated piece that's looking at all these mermaids, not just sightings of them, but carvings, paintings. They're everywhere throughout Italy. When I was in Florence a few years ago, I found them all over the place too. They're carved into buildings. They're very much this part of this seaborne identity in Renaissance Italy. So that's why I think that you had money, art, and exploration all coming together in spades in Italy. So it only makes sense that they're going to be illustrating mermaids a lot as this symbol of their exploration in the ocean and their wealth. And eventually by the 18th and 19th century, you see the same thing happening in London. Today in London, you can find mermaids all over the place as well. But that comes about more in the 18th and 19th century when London becomes a more powerful seaborne empire with it connected with the River Thames. It's part of this identity making that they're using the mermaid in Italy, not just for a way of like, oh, we're seeing them, but I would argue more as a way to identify themselves with the ocean, with power, with wonder, and maybe mastery over this sea trade as well.
Now, you've mentioned mermaids, some of them having double tails like Melusine, and some of them having, half women, some of them being half men. And this one that from Conrad Gessner calling it a man-fish. What exactly were the common themes here? I mean, we've talked about sightings of mermaids and records of encountering them, but were all mermaids the same thing and such that the description, if you said mermaid, you knew what you were talking about, or were there different kinds? What were mermaids like in the 16th century physically?
Yeah, this is really interesting because scholars today like to say, well, they were just seeing manatees. I wish it was that simple because this is something that hangs me up a lot. They aren't describing them like a manatee. Even one guy in the late 17th, early 18th century said he saw a mermaid in Africa. And he said, well, yeah, I mean, people say they look like manatees. And he gives this incredible illustration where he says, well, that's part of the trick. If you see them from above, they look like a manatee, but he draws a picture of them laid on their back where they look like a traditional mermaid, that the manatee thing's just kind of a cover. They're describing them in very clear terms as half woman or half man and half fish. And they're drawing them in this way, generally speaking. There is definitely a common theme, but interestingly, in my opinion, is the common theme isn't saying they are manatees. The common theme is giving them very human characteristics. In almost all of these descriptions, they go out of their way to say these are humanoid creatures. They don't say they don't look like a manatee, but they don't. They're not giving them these descriptions. They say they have hair like a woman. As I mentioned earlier, they're imbued with reason or endowed with reason. They cry out like a human. They have feminine features or masculine features. And when they're drawing them too, they're drawing them in these very humanoid terms. Now it ranges from these beautiful mermaids to more, quote, ugly mermaids. In London in the 18th century, there's this famous print drawn by a Frenchman of a siren, a mermaid who looks she's humanoid, but she doesn't look like the Little Mermaid as we think of. She looks more like something that could exist, a creature. Now, I say this because I always wonder, what are they seeing? Are they actually seeing anything? Are they making this up? But it's not just as simple, I don't think, as they're seeing manatees. And interestingly, I think it's 1968, the latter 50s or 60s, Benwell and Waugh wrote this book called Sea Enchantress, which was the last really kind of serious historical work on the history of, it's kind of like the earlier version of my book. And it's a very serious history, but they end their book by saying, look, these people who are, if you go where all these British people are seeing merpeople, manatees don't go that far north. The water's too cold for them up there. So what are they seeing that far north? And so it's really, I don't know. This is the question I keep coming back to. I don't believe in mermaids, but it has been interesting in all the reviews of this book, or most of them. One of the biggest thing that people come away with is, what were they seeing? Yeah. And it's when you read enough instances of smart people saying that they're seeing these mermaids and mermen and describing them in concrete terms, it really causes you to start to reflect, what are they seeing? Should I believe them? Should I not?
It sounds like they were seeing, there is some animal that maybe even has gone extinct by today. Yes. That makes it hard to pinpoint exactly what it was, but it sounds like there was at least some animal they were calling a mermaid.
Yeah.
Not to throw out a stupid thought. I hope that's an educated opinion, but
and you also get into psychology. It's, kind of like confirmation bias or something, where if you want to see something, you very much can. And it still goes, we see all this stuff with eyewitness accounts too today, with police officers basically can't trust eyewitness accounts. Our memory is so weird, the way we feel things. But the weird thing is just there were so many in my book. I have a map basically of all the sightings, were verified sightings in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And I'm pinpointing them, in the world, and just how many sightings there were. And they really, they go with, European sightings, and they correlate with where Europeans are going more often. So earlier on, it's all closer to Europe. But then as they start to explore the New World, you have them there, and you have them in the East Indies, and Africa. And I don't know what they were seeing. And that, I don't know is a lame answer, but I think one of the most interesting answers a lot of the time as well.
Well, I know that 16th century London loved to put anything strange on display for people to come and see. And I wonder, were merpeople ever put on display during Shakespeare's lifetime? Did they ever catch these things and put them up here and say, here it is, here's the mermaid I saw?
Definitely. Now, in the 16th century, in Shakespeare's time, there wouldn't have been as many actual specimens traveling. That really booms in the 18th century, but not like physical specimens, but there were physical specimens at the same time. In the 16th century, for instance, you have mermaid ribs and arms and these cabinets of curiosity. Now, I mentioned cabinets of curiosity earlier. These were critical for an 18th century Englishman, especially a wealthy Englishman, because it goes back to this mastery over the natural world. Any 18th century like naturalist or philosopher worth their salt would have had this. They called them Wunderkammern for the German pronunciation, but it was this cabinet of wonder, this cabinet of curiosity, where it could have been as simple as a cabinet in your house or a whole room in your house dedicated to strange specimens and artifacts from around the world. Visitors today, my favorite room in the British Museum is they call it the Enlightenment Room. But it's this giant cabinet of curiosity. You walk into the British Museum, it's your first room on the right, and it's just this incredible collection of specimens from around the world. It's not just specimens of creatures, but rather also artifacts from around the world, ancient artifacts, mummies. There is a mermaid specimen still in the British Museum that you can see. It's this shriveled up little creature about this big. You can look it up on the British Museum website. But interestingly, these became so popular, everyone wanted to say that they had a part of this mermaid. The Royal Society of London had in its collection, quote, the rib of a trident or merman, about the same length with that of a man's, but thicker and stronger, and nothing near so much bended. The fish to which it belonged was taken near Brazil. Now, they listed this among all their other holdings, and this was the Royal Society, and these were serious gentlemen. To even think to challenge their authority or their credulity was beyond means. So this was one of the most powerful group of thinkers in the Western world, holding the rib of a triton in their collections, in their very genteel, serious collections. And through the 17th and 18th century, you have other specimens coming to them, sightings coming to them. Eventually, Cotton Mather, very powerful colonist in the early 18th century, is going to write a letter to them saying that his friends have seen mermen off the coast of New England. Now he believes in them. So you're seeing them put on display in England in the 16th century, in so much as that there are these artifacts from them. But through the 17th and 18th century, you have dried up and mermaid specimens circulating throughout London. These they were half monkey, half codfish. They bought them in Asia. You have one guy, in fact, who sells a ship that isn't his for one of these and brings it back to London and thinks he's going to make all this money off of it. And you can read my book. It causes all these issues for him. Eventually, P.T. Barnum buys that same specimen and brings it to America. And it's a whole gaffe. But in the 16th century, you would have had mostly just tales, sailors coming back. There are taverns, oftentimes named the Mermaid Tavern. In fact, Shakespeare frequented a tavern called the Mermaid Tavern. It was his favorite place to go, and other writers like him did. But they mostly would have been these kind of ribs, hands of mermaids, and people would have really looked at them though with kind of reverence and like, what are these? And I think it really speaks to this that they have that, but also kind of even going further, mermaid specimens were displayed, if you will, on maps of the world. They were illustrated at the time, and they created farther one got from England. Oftentimes, they drew all these mysterious, fantastical creatures because they thought that the farther you got away, that you come in contact with them. And mermaids and mermen were some of the most popular. So people looking at these maps too would have thought, well, mermaids must be out there as well because they're drawn on this map.
This is such a fascinating topic, and there's tons more to explore, not the least of which is Vaughn's book, Merpeople. It's out now, and we'll link to where you can purchase that in the show notes for today's episode. But Vaughn, we would like to know some of your favorite books and resources you can recommend for us to use to learn more.
Yeah, so I mentioned the idea of the possum, and so I think that's a good kind of starting point for this idea of nature and the natural world and kind of strange things going on. So Susan Scott Parrish has a piece called The Female Opossum and the Nature of the New World in the William and Mary Quarterly. Now it's behind a paywall, but anyone who's reading could reach out to Dr. Parrish. Sure, she would be happy to share that article with you. It's fascinating. She has a larger book on the subject, but the possum is only mentioned in it. So that's why I talked about the article. Tara Peterson's for interest in the Shakespeare life. She wrote a book called Mermaids and the Production of Knowledge in Early Modern England, where she really looks at how plays especially are producing ideas of the mermaid. So this is very much a literary history of merpeople. I love Alison Luke's Mermaids of Venice. I mentioned this earlier. It's called Fantastic Sea Creatures of Venetian Renaissance Art. Alison Luke's is a curator at, I can't remember which art museum. I think it's at the Met, I think. But this is an incredible volume. It's lavishly illustrated, very well researched. It was a great resource for me when I started trying to pinpoint what's going on in the Renaissance period with mermaids. And finally, I mentioned maps a little bit. For those of you who are interested in like how maps are producing interest in mermaids and producing them literally, Chet Van Duser's Sea Monsters on Medieval and Renaissance Maps is really interesting as well. One of my favorite things about most of these volumes on mermaids, including mine, is that illustrations and artwork and drawings are so important for this. And this is one of my favorite things about writing this book, is that it necessitated that I push beyond my boundaries. I'm usually a 16th, 17th, 18th century historian. But this book forced me to go beyond temporally, but also forced me to look into all these different sources that I found myself pouring through digitized copies of medieval manuscripts and bestiaries, just, reading, having to translate Latin and Italian and it was incredible. I hope that the book and the research comes through with this. I couldn't have written this book 20 years ago, not only because I was in my 30, because I was in my adolescence at the period, but today with the internet and with, email, I could reach out. If I was interested in something, I could shoot an email to someone. I found instances of mermaids being drawn in ancient South African desert art. And I was able to reach out to people who studied that, archaeologists and anthropologists, and get images from them. And so it's and all these other books kind of speak to this as well. So it's a fascinating topic.
We will link to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, including where you can learn more about Vaughn and his book. So make sure you stop by there to see all of those. Vaughn, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and you get to do a take two, because last time you got to pick your desert island book as well. But the question is, what is the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
All right. Last time I said Lord of the Rings. And now that technically is one book, I will say, because Tolkien originally wanted to make it one book. His publishers made it break up into three. So, yeah. Okay. But I'm not going to be lame and say it again. I think my other one might be a little bit more whimsical, and it has mermaids in it, by the way. I'd say cool. J.M. Barrie's original Peter Pan, but it's a specific issue that I have it, but I'm not going to go pick it up. It's this incredibly illustrated issue as well. I can't remember the illustrator, but it was one of the first books that really enchanted me, because not only was it a great book to read, but it had these incredible illustrations. One that is of mermaids, but I think that Peter Pan would be my next one. It's
excellent choice for sure.
Yeah, it's so good. And I also, just as kind of an aside, the film Hook enchanted me too. And I will stand by until he gets to Neverland. The first part of Hook is incredible because it really gets into the wonder and mystery that is baked into the original Peter Pan book. Yep. And I think that all kind of overlaps there.
I agree. Totally. So now that you've finished Merpeople, what is next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I've got two projects I'm really excited about right now. Now, the first one I've been working on for quite a while. I have a book prospectus out with a publisher. It is looking at All right. So we always, especially as Americans, we think of the American Revolution through the lens of, quote, Americans who are actually just British rebels, technically, but I won't get into that. But this book is it's looking at how British and Hessian soldiers coming over to fight in the American Revolution, how they viewed the natural world and how they viewed it as this alien, dangerous place that was going to damage and destroy their bodies and minds. So it's all getting into perception. So before they're coming over, they've heard all these things about the New World, like we're talking about in here. And it's the climate can hurt them. There are all these strange animals and creatures, the environment, the weather. And so this really shapes their experiences in the American Revolution. So I'm looking at, you have to understand why the British lose. Well, the environment was a huge part of it. That in many ways, we can't discount that. That's my first one. Now, over the break, I've become completely enthralled, and this is going to be my fourth book project, with this guy named Timothy Dexter. He was, okay, we often think that like there's no precedent maybe for someone like Donald Trump and that his rise to power and all the things he's done. There is. His name's Timothy Dexter. He was born in New England in the 1740s. As a poor man. He worked up in the leather trade. By 1800, he lived in Newburyport, Massachusetts. He called himself the Lord of Newburyport. He wrote his own book. He was illiterate, but he wrote his own book with had no punctuation, horrible spelling. He built statues of himself. He held his own mock funeral when he was alive. You look him up, but I'm working on writing the first book on him in 60 years. And I found all kinds of new interesting primary sources. And it's going to use him as this vessel to kind of understand celebrity and fame and self-creation in the early republic. He is absolutely fascinating. He's as much myth as man at this point. There have been podcasts on him. There have been but a lot of it's fake stuff. I'm trying to get to the core of who he might have really been. And it's really, I mean, I've had multiple days over in the last couple of weeks where I've spent 8 hours in a day just sitting at my computer researching and finding out all this new stuff. So I'm really excited about that as well.
That sounds like truly exciting stuff. And as much as we've enjoyed the book Merpeople, I know these coming books will be exciting as well. Vaughn Scribner, thank you so much for being here this week and taking us into the world of mermaids of the 16th century. This has been fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Find links to the resources Vaughn mentions today, as well as several of the archival images from Conrad Gessner and others, along with primary sources and more information on how to keep up with Vaughn's recently published book, all packed into the show notes for today's episode. Find all these things, along with a beautiful freebie and coloring sheet for mermaids, so you can add your own mermaid illustrations to the history of merpeople today, all at CassidyCash.com/episode 149. That's CassidyCash.com/EP149. The video version of this week's episode will go out in part on YouTube this week, so make sure you visit youtube.com/c/CassidyCash to subscribe to the channel and be able to watch the first half of our interview done as a mini documentary style presentation. So you'll be able to see a lot of the images we talk about on the show today overlaid during the conversation so that you can see what we're talking about as we're talking about it. The entire documentary will be available inside the digital streaming app for That Shakespeare Life. You can subscribe for $5 a month and get the video version for today's podcast as well as others, along with animated plays and documentary shorts. Find all of that at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.